The wind screamed across the mountains like something alive. Snow swirled through the pine trees in violent white waves, burying the narrow trail that led toward the old cabin, hidden deep inside the Rockies. The storm had already swallowed the moon. Night pressed down over the wilderness like a heavy hand. And in the middle of that frozen darkness sat a man so large and still he almost looked carved from stone. Elias Boone rested against the cabin wall, with his broad shoulders covered in snow. His beard was frozen solid. Blood stained one sleeve of his coat. His eyes looked hollow, like a man who had already buried too much of himself to feel fear anymore. But the tiny infant crying in his arms was breaking him apart. The baby screamed with the desperate, painful cry of hunger. Elias looked down at the child helplessly. His massive hands strong enough to skin elk and split wood through winter storms, trembled against the thin blanket wrapped around the infant. The crying would not stop. He tried rocking the child, tried whispering, tried pacing through the snow outside the cabin. Nothing worked. Inside the cabin, the fire had nearly died, and on the small bed near the wall lay the baby's mother beneath a wool blanket, stained dark with blood. Dead before sunrise. The storm had trapped them for 2 days. The woman had stumbled onto Elias's mountain weeks earlier, barely alive and carrying a child that was nearly due. She never spoke much about herself, never gave more than her first name, never explained who she was running from. Elias had not asked. People came to the mountains to disappear. He understood that better than anyone. But now she was gone, and the child would soon follow her if he could not figure out how to keep it alive. The baby's cries grew weaker. Elias swallowed hard and looked toward the dark forest. For years, the mountains had feared him. Men in town called him a beast. Children whispered stories about him around campfires. Some swore he once killed a wolf with his bare hands after it attacked his horse during a blizzard. Elias never cared what they believed. Fear kept people away, and people brought pain. But now, for the first time in years, he wished somebody would come. Anybody. The baby suddenly coughed hard, its tiny body shaking violently inside the blanket. Panic flashed through Elias's eyes. "No," he muttered under his breath. His voice sounded rough from disuse. No, stay with me." The child continued crying weakly. Elias looked back toward the cabin, where the dead woman lay in silence. Then he stared into the storm again. The snow kept falling. Endless. Cold. Merciless. And then, through the white darkness, he heard something. A horse, faint at first, then wheels creaking against frozen ground. Elias rose instantly. One hand grabbed the rifle, leaning beside the cabin door. His body moved with the sharp instinct of a hunted animal. The wagon slowly emerged through the storm lantern glow, flickering weakly against the snow. Old, half-broken, pulled by a tired gray horse, barely able to stand. The wagon stopped several yards from the cabin. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the driver climbed down. A woman. She wore a dark winter coat covered in frost and held the reins with red, trembling hands. Snow clung to strands of chestnut hair escaping beneath her hood. When she looked up and saw Elias standing there with the rifle, she froze. Most people did. Elias Boone looked less like a man and more like the mountain itself. Tall enough to tower over nearly anyone. Thick shoulders, heavy beard. Eyes cold from years alone in the wilderness. The kind of man people crossed streets to avoid. The infant cried again. The woman's eyes shifted downward toward the bundle in his arms, then toward the cabin, then back to the blood on his sleeve. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. "You lost?" he asked coldly. The woman studied him carefully. Then she noticed something else. The way Elias held the baby. Awkward. Terrified. Like a man trying to stop the world from falling apart inside his hands. The woman stepped closer. "I heard crying," she said softly. Elias said nothing. Wind howled between the trees. The horse behind her shivered violently. The baby cried again, weaker this time. The woman's expression changed immediately. "That child's freezing." Elias stared at her. "She won't eat," he admitted quietly. The woman slowly approached without fear. Most people looked at Elias Boone and saw danger, but she saw exhaustion, pain, and a man moments away from losing the last living thing under his protection. "May I?" she asked carefully. Elias hesitated. For several long seconds he did not move. Then, finally, slowly, he handed her the child. The baby looked impossibly small in her arms. She pulled open her coat, shielding the infant from the wind with her own body. Her movements were calm and practiced. "You need heat," she said quickly. "Boiled water. Clean cloth. Anything warm." Elias lowered the rifle. For the first time all night, somebody else had taken control of the panic swallowing the cabin whole. The woman looked up at him again. "My name is Clara." Elias stared at her silently before answering. Another gust slammed through the trees. Clara looked toward the dark cabin. "You're going to let me inside," she said firmly, "or this baby dies before morning." For a moment, Elias simply stood there, beneath the storm snow collecting across his shoulders. Then he stepped aside. Clara carried the infant toward the cabin, and without realizing it, Elias Boone allowed another human being into his life for the first time in nearly 8 years. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke blood and pine sap. Clara immediately got to work. She stirred the dying fire, boiled snow water, tore strips from one of her own underskirts to wrap the child properly. The infant cried weakly, while Elias stood near the doorway, watching helplessly. He looked completely out of place beside something so fragile. Clara glanced at the dead woman lying beneath the blanket. "How long ago?" she asked gently. "This morning." "You alone?" Elias nodded once. Clara swallowed hard. Outside, the storm battered the cabin walls. Inside, only the crackling fire and the baby's cries filled the silence. Clara finally managed to feed the child a few drops of watered goat milk from a rag cloth. Slowly, the crying softened. Elias stared in disbelief. The tiny body relaxed against Clara's chest. Alive. Still alive. A strange expression crossed Elias's face then. Not relief. Something deeper. Like a drowning man, suddenly finding air. Clara noticed the look in his eyes. This terrifying mountain man had been completely alone with death and a screaming infant in the middle of a blizzard. And despite everything people said about him, he had stayed. He had not abandoned the child. That told her more about Elias Boone than any rumor ever could. Hours later, the storm still raged outside. Clara sat near the fire, holding the sleeping infant, while Elias silently repaired a broken roof beam. Finally, Clara spoke. "People in Black Hollow say terrible things about you." Elias kept working. "They usually do." She studied him carefully. "They say you killed men." "I have." The answer came without emotion. Clara looked toward the rifle near the door. Elias noticed. "The mountains kill softer men than me," he said quietly. Silence returned. Then Clara asked the question carefully. "Why stay alone out here?" The hammer in Elias's hand stopped moving. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Only the storm spoke. Then, finally, he answered without turning around. "Because everybody near me dies." The word settled heavily inside the cabin. Clara looked toward the dead woman again, then toward the infant sleeping beside the fire. And suddenly, she understood something. This giant mountain man was not dangerous because he lacked humanity. He was dangerous because life had taken too much of it away. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold. The storm had weakened, but the mountains remained buried beneath deep snow. Clara stepped outside the cabin and looked down toward the valley below. Somewhere far beyond the trees sat the town of Black Hollow, the place she had fled 3 nights earlier, the place she could never safely return to. Inside the cabin, Elias sharpened a hunting knife beside the fire, while the infant slept nearby. Clara watched him carefully. Everything about him felt rough and worn down by years of isolation. The scar across his jaw, the old bullet wound near his shoulder, the way he constantly listened to the forest, even while sitting still, like a man expecting danger every second. "You fought in the frontier wars," Clara said quietly. Elias glanced up sharply. "How'd you know? You move like soldiers do." Elias returned to sharpening the blade. "Used to guide patrols through the mountains." Clara waited. Eventually, Elias spoke again. "Long time ago." Something dark moved behind his eyes. Clara recognized it immediately. Grief, not fresh grief, the kind that settles into a person permanently. "What happened?" she asked softly. The blade stopped against the stone. For a while, Elias simply stared into the fire. Then finally he spoke. "My wife and son died because of me." Clara remained silent. Elias's voice stayed low and distant. There was a mining camp near the northern ridge. Army wanted the land cleared. Said raiders were hiding there. His jaw tightened. They were wrong. The fire cracked loudly. I led soldiers through the pass. Thought I was protecting my family by helping them. His eyes darkened. When the shooting started, my cabin got caught in it. Clara felt her chest tighten. Elias stared into the flames, as if seeing that night again. My boy was 5. Silence swallowed the room. The bullets hit both of them before I reached the house. Clara lowered her eyes. No wonder the mountains feared him. A man surviving something like that either became hollow or became dangerous. I buried them myself, Elias whispered. Outside, wind rattled the cabin walls. Then he looked toward the sleeping infant beside the fire. I wasn't supposed to care about anybody again, but he already did. Clara could hear it in his voice, and somehow that frightened him more than the storm outside. By afternoon, Elias prepared to leave for hunting. Clara stood near the doorway, holding the baby wrapped tightly in blankets. "You don't have to stay," Elias said, without looking at her. Clara almost laughed at that. Stay were back in Black Hollow, where Jeremiah Pike waited like a vulture over everything she had left. She remembered the banker's cold smile, the fake debt papers, the sheriff standing beside him while men carried her furniture into the street after her husband died. Jeremiah Pike owned half the town. The bank, the grain storage, even the sheriff. People who crossed him usually disappeared beneath debt or violence. Clara looked down at the infant, then back at Elias Boone. "I think," she said quietly, "this child already has enough ghosts around her." Elias met her eyes. For the first time in years, somebody had chosen not to run from him, and neither of them yet understood how much blood that choice would cost before winter ended. 3 days later, the storm finally loosened its grip on the mountains. Sunlight spilled across the snowfields in pale silver ribbons, turning the frozen wilderness almost beautiful again. Smoke drifted from the cabin chimney in slow, peaceful curls. Inside, warmth had begun replacing death. Clara moved quietly around the cabin, While the infant slept inside a wooden drawer Elias had lined with rabbit fur and wool blankets to serve as a cradle. The giant mountain man sat near the fire repairing a saddle strap with thick, careful fingers. Every few seconds his eyes lifted toward the child, as if checking whether she still breathed. Clara noticed it every time. Elias Boone never truly relaxed anymore. Not since she arrived. Not since the baby came into his life. The silence between them no longer felt cold. It felt lived in. Outside, Elias chopped wood. Inside, Clara cooked thin stew from elk meat and potatoes. At night, the infant's crying echoed through the cabin, while both of them stumbled half awake trying to calm her. The mountains remained brutal, but something softer had started growing beneath that roof. One evening, Clara stood beside the wash basin, cleaning blood from Elias's old coat. When her fingers brushed against a small, stitched pocket hidden inside the lining, she hesitated, then carefully pulled out a faded photograph. A woman stood beside Elias in front of a small cabin surrounded by pine trees. In her arms rested a little boy, no older than 5. The child had Elias's eyes. Clara stared quietly at the picture. "You kept it all these years," she whispered. Elias looked over from the fireplace. For a moment his face hardened. Then slowly he stood and crossed the room. "My wife hated having pictures taken," he muttered. "Said they stole pieces of people." His voice softened slightly as he looked down at the photograph. "But my boy loved it." Clara studied the picture carefully. The woman in it looked happy. So did Elias. It almost felt impossible compared to the broken man standing before her now. "You smiled different there," Clara said quietly. Elias said nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low, mournful sound. Then suddenly the baby began crying again. Clara moved to pick her up, but Elias gently stopped her. "I got her." The words surprised both of them. Elias carefully lifted the tiny infant into his massive arms. His movements still looked awkward, but no longer frightened. The baby fussed softly against his chest, then slowly calmed. Clara watched silently. "What was her mother's name?" she asked. Elias stared down at the child. "She never told me her full name." "That's strange." She trusted nobody. Clara understood that feeling well. Elias rocked the child gently near the fire. "She kept asking if riders came near the mountain," he said quietly. Every night she checked the windows. Fear moved through Clara's stomach. "Did she ever say why?" Elias shook his head. Then he frowned slightly. "She wore a necklace, though." Clara looked up sharply. "What kind?" Elias walked toward the table and opened a small tin box near the lantern. Inside rested a silver necklace with a tiny engraved rose. The second Clara saw it all, the color drained from her face. Her hands began trembling. Elias immediately noticed. "You know it." Clara slowly reached toward the necklace. "My mother owned one exactly like this." Elias frowned. "There were only 3. "For maid," Clara whispered. The cabin suddenly felt very small. Clara carefully turned the necklace over, and there it was. The same family mark burned into the silver. "Whitmore." Her throat tightened instantly. She was family. Clara whispered. Elias stared at her silently. "My cousin Eleanor disappeared almost a year ago after her husband died." Clara's breathing grew shallow. "She wrote me once. Said somebody dangerous was following her." Then the letters stopped. She looked toward the sleeping infant. Emotion flooded her face so suddenly she had to turn away. "That baby." Elias already understood. "Your blood." Clara nodded slowly. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, snow slid heavily from the cabin roof. Then Clara whispered the question that terrified her most. Did Eleanor ever mention a man named Jeremiah Pike? Elias's eyes narrowed. "Number." Clara swallowed hard. "He destroyed my husband." That night, Clara finally told Elias everything. How her husband Thomas had worked bookkeeping for the Black Hollow Rail Company. How he discovered land records being forged. How families suddenly lost farms after impossible debts appeared from nowhere. And always behind it stood Jeremiah Pike. Rich, polished, untouchable. A man who smiled while stealing entire lives. Thomas wanted proof before exposing him, Clara said quietly near the fire. Then, one night, he came home terrified. The infant slept beside them, while shadows flickered across the cabin walls. He said Jeremiah had men killing people over land rights near the railroad expansion. Elias listened without interruption. 2 weeks later, Thomas died in the mine collapse. Her voice cracked. But he never worked the mines. Elias's eyes slowly lifted toward her. Clara nodded. They made it look like an accident. Silence filled the room. Then Elias asked the question softly. What happened to the proof? Clara stared into the fire. I never found it. But even as she said the words, something inside her doubted that was true. The next morning, the mountains turned violent again. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks before sunrise. Wind hammered through the trees hard enough to shake the cabin walls. Elias stepped outside and immediately sensed trouble. Storm, a bad one. He quickly secured the horses while Clara gathered blankets and supplies inside. By midday, snow blasted sideways across the mountain. The infant suddenly began coughing violently. Clara touched the baby's forehead and froze. She's burning up. Elias immediately crossed the room. The child's tiny body shook beneath the blankets. She needs medicine, Clara whispered. We out. Clara nodded grimly. The nearest doctor sat nearly 20 miles away in Black Hollow, and the storm was worsening by the minute. Elias grabbed his coat. Clara turned sharply. You can't ride through this. She won't survive till morning without fever tonic. The baby cried weakly again. Clara looked terrified. Outside, the wind screamed across the mountainside. You could die out there, she whispered. Elias loaded shells into his rifle calmly. I've died before. Then he pulled his coat tight and stepped into the storm. Snow immediately swallowed him whole. The ride to Black Hollow nearly killed him. Twice the horse slipped crossing frozen ridges. Branches snapped through the blizzard like rifle shots. Ice covered Elias's beard and eyelashes until he looked carved from winter itself. But he kept riding, because somewhere behind him, a tiny child fought to breathe. By the time he reached town after dark, the streets were nearly empty beneath the storm. Then somebody saw him. A drunk stumbling from the saloon froze instantly. Jesus Christ, the man whispered. Within minutes, word spread across Black Hollow. Elias Boone had come down from the mountains. People peeked nervously through windows as he rode past. Some still remembered the last time he entered town. Years earlier, after burying his wife and son. Back then, he nearly beat a man to death for mocking their graves. The pharmacy sat beside the bank. Light glowed warmly behind the frosted windows. Elias stepped inside, carrying snow and cold with him. Conversation stopped instantly. 3 men near the stove slowly lowered their whiskey glasses. The pharmacist swallowed hard. Elias approached the counter. Need fever medicine. The pharmacist hurried nervously through shelves, gathering bottles and cloth. Then another voice spoke from the shadows. Well now, the man drawled smoothly. Look what wandered out of the mountains. Elias slowly turned. Jeremiah Pike stood near the back office wearing a dark wool coat and polished boots untouched by mud or snow. Everything about him looked expensive. Clean hands, silver watch chain, cold smile. Behind him stood Sheriff Grady, with one hand resting near his revolver. Jeremiah studied Elias carefully. You usually avoid civilized places. Elias ignored him. Medicine, he repeated coldly. The pharmacist quickly wrapped the supplies, but Jeremiah's eyes narrowed slightly. For who? Elias grabbed the package. None of your concern. Jeremiah smiled faintly. Funny thing about these mountains, he said casually. Sometimes people disappear up there. Elias stopped moving. The room felt colder instantly. Jeremiah stepped closer. A widow vanished from town recently, he continued. Pretty woman. Brown hair. Clara. Elias said nothing, but Jeremiah noticed the reaction anyway, and that tiny flicker told him everything he needed. The widow was alive, and somehow Elias Boone was protecting her. Jeremiah's smile widened almost invisibly. Well, he said softly, if you happen to see her. Elias suddenly stepped forward so fast the sheriff flinched. The entire room froze. Jeremiah's confidence cracked for the first time as Elias towered over him like a storm given human form. Then Elias spoke quietly. If I see you near my mountain. His eyes burned cold as death. They'll never find enough of you to bury. Silence swallowed the pharmacy whole. Then Elias turned and walked back into the blizzard. But Jeremiah Pike kept smiling after he left, because now he knew exactly where to look. An hour later, Elias rode through the storm toward home. The medicine sat safely inside his coat. Snow hammered against his face hard enough to blind him. Then suddenly the horse screamed. Gunfire exploded from the trees. The bullet tore through Elias's shoulder and knocked him sideways from the saddle into deep snow. 3 riders emerged through the storm, hired guns. Jeremiah worked fast. Elias rolled just as another shot blasted into the snow beside his head. Pain exploded through his shoulder. One rider charged straight toward him holding a revolver. Elias grabbed the man's leg with terrifying force as the horse passed. The rider screamed before Elias ripped him violently from the saddle. Both men crashed into the snow. The gun fired wildly into the darkness. Elias slammed his fist into the attacker's face once. Bones cracked instantly. Another rider fired again. The bullet tore through Elias's coat. Elias grabbed his rifle and fired back. The first rider fell from his horse into the snow without a sound. Wind screamed through the trees. The third attacker hesitated. That mistake saved Elias's life. Elias buried a hunting knife deep into the man's chest before he could fire again. Then silence returned. Only the storm remained. Elias staggered toward his horse, bleeding heavily into the snow. His shoulder burned with agony. But through the pain, only one thought remained inside his head. Get home. Get the medicine to the child. Hours later, Clara heard pounding against the cabin door. She opened it and gasped. Elias collapsed inside, covered in blood and ice. The medicine bottles rolled from his coat onto the floorboards. Clara dropped beside him instantly. Oh, God. Elias could barely breathe in. But even then, his first words were not about himself. The baby, he whispered. Rose began crying softly near the fire, and for the first time since Clara met him, she realized something terrifying. Elias Boone would let the entire mountain kill him before allowing harm to reach that child. For 2 days, Elias drifted in and out of fever. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, but the wound burned hot and angry beneath Clara's bandages. Sometimes he woke swinging wildly at shadows that no longer existed. Sometimes he muttered names in his sleep, his wife, his son. And sometimes he whispered apologies to ghosts only he could still see. Clara barely slept. She boiled water, changed bandages, fed Rose beside the fire, while winter storms rolled endlessly beyond the cabin walls. Outside, the mountain remained cruel and silent. Inside, something fragile was trying to survive. On the 3rd night, Elias finally opened his eyes fully. The fever had weakened him. His face looked pale beneath the heavy beard, and exhaustion dragged beneath his eyes like bruises. Clara sat beside the fire with Rose asleep against her chest. "You should have let me die out there," Elias muttered weakly. Clara looked up sharply. "No. I bring trouble. You brought medicine." Elias stared at the ceiling silently. Then his eyes shifted toward Rose. The child slept peacefully for once, wrapped tightly beneath patched blankets. "She smiles when she hears your boots outside," Clara said quietly. Something painful moved behind Elias's eyes, like hope trying to return to a place it no longer belonged. But peace never lasted long in the frontier. The next morning, Elias stepped outside for the first time since the ambush. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he scanned the mountains. Tracks. Fresh. At least 6 horses. His entire body stiffened instantly. The riders had circled the cabin during the night. Watching. Waiting. Elias hurried back inside. "Pack everything," he said immediately. Clara saw the danger in his face. "What happened?" "We're not alone anymore." The cabin suddenly felt smaller. Rose began fussing near the fireplace as Clara gathered supplies with shaking hands. Elias loaded rifles carefully despite the pain ripping through his shoulder. Then, from somewhere deep in the valley below, came the faint echo of dogs barking. Hunting dogs. Clara froze. Jeremiah. By sunset they appeared. 6 riders emerged through the trees beneath the dying orange light. Jeremiah Pike rode at the front, wearing black gloves and a heavy fur coat. Beside him sat Sheriff Grady, holding a shotgun across his lap. The rest were hired gunmen, hard men with dead eyes. Jeremiah looked almost amused as he stared toward the cabin. Well, now he called out loudly. Looks like the mountain beast finally built himself a family. Elias stepped outside holding the rifle one-handed. Clara stood behind him in the doorway, with Rose wrapped tightly against her chest. Snow drifted between them silently. Jeremiah's smile widened when he saw Clara. "There she is! You stay away from us!" Clara shouted. Jeremiah laughed softly. "You still don't understand your situation, Mrs. Whitmore." His eyes slowly shifted toward the cabin. "Your husband stole something valuable from me before he died." "He stole proof," Clara snapped back. That wiped the smile from Jeremiah's face instantly. The gunman shifted uneasily. Jeremiah stepped down from his horse slowly. "You know," he said calmly, "people in town already believe Elias Boone murdered that woman inside your cabin." His eyes flicked toward Rose. "One word from me, and they'll hang him before sunrise." Elias raised the rifle slightly. Jeremiah stopped moving. Wind swept through the trees, carrying the scent of snow and smoke. Then Jeremiah smiled again. Or he continued smoothly. "You hand over the land papers, and nobody else gets hurt." Clara's stomach turned cold. So that was it. He still wanted the documents. Elias spoke quietly, without taking his eyes off the men. "Go home," Jeremiah chuckled. "I don't think you understand who owns this mountain anymore." Then he nodded once toward his men. Everything exploded at once. Gunfire shattered the silence. Clara screamed and dropped behind the doorway, clutching Rose. Bullets ripped through the cabin walls. Wood splintered violently around the fireplace. Elias fired once. One gunman tumbled from his horse instantly. Another shot blasted through the window beside Elias's head. Smoke filled the freezing air. The horses panicked. Sheriff Grady shouted orders, while Jeremiah backed away from the fighting. Coward! Elias moved like an animal born for violence. Despite the injured shoulder, he fired again, forcing 2 men behind trees. Then, suddenly, flames burst near the cabin roof. One of Jeremiah's men had thrown a lantern. Fire crawled upward hungrily against the dry wood. Clara stared in horror. "No!" Rose began screaming. Smoke poured through the cabin ceiling while gunfire echoed outside. Elias kicked the front door closed and turned toward Clara. "There's a ravine behind the cabin," he growled. "Take the horse and ride north." "What about you?" Elias grabbed more shells. "I'll hold them here." Clara looked at him in disbelief. "You'll die." Elias stared toward the burning walls calmly. "Not before they do." Outside, Jeremiah shouted again. "Bring me the papers." The fire spread rapidly now. Smoke thickened around the ceiling beams, while sparks rained across the floorboards. Then suddenly, Rose began crying harder than before. Clara looked down instinctively. The silver necklace around the baby's neck had slipped loose from the blanket. Jeremiah saw it through the doorway, and his face changed instantly. Recognition. Fear. For the first time that night, Jeremiah Pike looked genuinely shaken. "Get that child!" he screamed suddenly. Everything stopped inside Clara's mind. Why did the necklace frighten him? Then she remembered Eleanor, the missing cousin, the fear, the running. The truth hit her all at once. Rose was not just Eleanor's child. She was evidence. Jeremiah had known Eleanor carried something dangerous before she vanished. something connected to the stolen land. Clara's eyes widened. "The papers," she whispered. Elias glanced toward her quickly. Clara suddenly remembered the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Thomas never hid the proof for himself. He hid it for the child. She rushed across the smoke-filled cabin and tore up the loose wooden plank near the fireplace. Inside rested folded documents wrapped in oilcloth, but beneath them sat something else. A ledger. Jeremiah saw it immediately and turned pale beneath the snow. "No," he whispered. Elias noticed. "What is it?" Clara flipped open the ledger quickly. Names, payments, deaths, entire families marked beside land transfers and railroad claims. And there, among the signatures, sat Jeremiah Pike's name beside dozens of illegal purchases. But one line froze Elias solid. Northern Ridge Clearing Operation. Army payment approved by J. Pike. Elias slowly took the ledger from Clara's hands. His breathing stopped. Beneath the line sat the exact date his wife and son died. The world around him disappeared. The fire, the snow, the gunshots, all gone. Only that date remained. Jeremiah took a step backward outside. He understood immediately. Elias now knew the truth. Years ago, Jeremiah had secretly financed the military clearing operation to force settlers from valuable silver land near the ridge. Elias's family had not died by accident. They had died because Jeremiah Pike wanted money. Elias lifted his eyes slowly toward the banker, and Jeremiah finally looked afraid. Real fear. The kind no amount of money could stop. The cabin roof groaned loudly as flames spread overhead. Sheriff Grady stared at the ledger in horror. "You told us raiders attacked that settlement," he whispered toward Jeremiah. Jeremiah snapped angrily. "Shut your mouth." But Grady already understood. All these years, he had protected a murderer. Jeremiah reached for his revolver. Elias moved first. The mountain man exploded through the burning doorway, like something unleashed from hell itself. He slammed into Jeremiah hard enough to send both men crashing into the snow. The banker screamed as Elias's fists hammered into him with years of buried grief and rage. Gunmen rushed forward. Sheriff Grady suddenly raised his shotgun toward them. "Stand down," he roared. Nobody moved. Snow fell silently around the chaos. Jeremiah crawled backward through the snow, bleeding heavily. "You don't understand," he gasped desperately. "I made this town rich." "You murdered children," Grady said coldly. Jeremiah tried running. Elias followed. The chase tore through the snowy forest beneath black pine trees bending under winter wind. Jeremiah stumbled constantly, his expensive boots slipping through deep drifts. Elias never slowed. Not now. Not after 8 years of carrying graves inside his chest. Finally, Jeremiah reached the edge of a frozen ravine. Nowhere left to run. He turned shakily, holding the revolver with bloody, trembling hands. "You kill me," he rasped, "and you become exactly what they say you are." Elias stared at him silently. Snow collected across his shoulders. His face looked carved from stone. Then Jeremiah fired. Click. Frozen chamber. No bullet. Pure terror flooded Jeremiah's face. Elias stepped forward slowly. Jeremiah dropped to his knees instantly. "Please." But Elias no longer saw a wealthy banker. He saw his son buried beneath snow, his wife bleeding on cabin floors. Years stolen, lives stolen, everything because one greedy man wanted land. Elias grabbed Jeremiah by the coat and dragged him back toward town through the snow. Black Hollow gathered in silence as dawn rose gray across the valley. The ledger passed from hand to trembling hand. Every crime, every theft, every murder, all written clearly in Jeremiah's own records. Families began crying openly in the streets. Men realized how many neighbors had disappeared because of him. Sheriff Grady arrested Jeremiah himself. And before sunset, the town carried out frontier justice beneath the hanging tree near the courthouse. Elias did not watch. He stood outside town beside Clara and Rose, while the bells rang in the distance. Winter slowly began loosening its hold after that. Snow melted from the rooftops. Rivers flowed again. Smoke rose peacefully from the repaired cabin high in the mountains. The town no longer feared Elias Boone. Some even brought supplies quietly to the mountain trail in thanks. But Elias never cared much about towns. Everything he needed now existed beneath that small cabin roof. One warm spring morning, Clara stepped outside carrying Rose beneath golden sunlight. The little girl laughed as Elias lifted her high into the air with one enormous hand. For the first time in years, the mountain man smiled without pain, hiding behind it. The scars remained. They always would. But the silence inside him no longer felt empty. Near the doorway, Clara watched him carefully. "You know," she said softly, "she stops crying every time you hold her." Elias looked down at Rose, resting peacefully against his chest. The child grabbed his beard and laughed again. Birdsong drifted through the pine trees. Snowmelt trickled softly down the rocks nearby. And for the first time since death had taken everything from him, Elias Boone no longer felt alone in the world. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.